In this lesson, we will learn how to create a table of data with HTML. Let's imagine that we had a grocery list, but instead of only keeping track of the name of the item, let's imagine that we also wanted to keep track of its price, what aisle in the store it's located on, and also quantity, how many we want of that particular item. With all of these different details of the grocery items in mind, it doesn't make sense to use a simple bulleted list. Instead, it makes sense to create a table. So our goal for this lesson is to create a table of our grocery list data so you can become familiar with table syntax. Let's get started. The HTML code to begin creating a table is simply table. Within the table element, we then use the tr element, which stands for table row, to create a row. Within the table row element, we can then use td for table data to create columns. So for example, our first table data element, or our first column, will simply say bread. The next column, we will include the aisle that bread is located at in the store. So we'll say that it's on aisle 2. And the third column will include the price of bread. So we will say that it costs $3. And the fourth column will include the quantity. So we only want one loaf of bread. If I save and refresh in my web browser, we can see the beginnings of a table. All of the data associated with the bread item sits on a single row. Let's try to add another item, milk. So we would create another row. Each item receives its own table row. And then within that table row element, again, we'll create td elements, which stand for table data. So milk. What aisle is milk on? We'll say that it's on aisle 1. How much does milk cost? $2.50. And we'll say that we want 2 milks, 2 small cartons of milk. So if we save and refresh, we can see a second row in our table. It's very easy to track all of the data across a single row. However, our table desperately needs some sort of labeling system. It's not clear to the user what these numbers even stand for. Throughout the video, we've mentioned that the first number is associated with the aisle that the item is on, and that the final number at the end of the row is the quantity, but we need a way of labeling that on screen. And we can do that by creating a row at the top of the table with table headers. So within this table row, instead of td for table data, we can create table cells or table columns by using the th element, table header. So the first column is the item name. The second column is the aisle that the item can be found on. The third column is the price. And the fourth column is the quantity. So if I save and refresh, we can see that our table is now clearly labeled. So let's review the syntax. To create a table, you use the very intuitively named table element. Each row of the table is created by tr, which stands for table row. Within that, we create table cells. There are 2 types of table cells. The first that we saw, td, is for data. It stands for table data. The second type of table cell is th, which stands for table header. These 2 types allow us to differentiate between labels or headers and actual data in our table. Now, there are a few additional wrapper elements that will also allow us to differentiate between headers and data. It's considered best practice to wrap any header information in the table inside a thead element. So I will cut and paste the row with our table headers into the thead element. It's also a best practice to include all of the table's actual data inside a tbody element, table body. So I will cut and paste our data rows to sit within the tbody element. Now if I save and refresh in the browser, we don't see any visual change by using thead and tbody. However, using these elements is a good idea for 2 reasons. Number 1, it gives us additional hooks to play with later on when we're familiar with CSS, or in other words, when we want to style the table. And number two, it increases the semantic richness of our code. Before we close out this lesson on HTML tables, there's one final organizational element that I want to bring to your attention. In addition to T-head and T-body, there's also T-foot for table footer. Now, even if we place table footer above table body, it will still be displayed in the web browser below the body content. So let's create a row in our footer, for example. So within T-foot, we'll create a row, and within that row, we'll create 4 columns. The name of this bottom footer row will be all. So it's all items. What aisle is it on? Not applicable. The next column is the price, so that's $5.50. And the fourth column is quantity. Again, that is not applicable. So now if we save and refresh, we can see that the table footer row sits at the bottom, even though in the markup in our HTML it sits above the table body. Now in older versions of HTML, you were required to place the table footer above the table body in your code. But in the newest version of HTML, it's okay to include the table footer or T-foot at the bottom of your table. On a side note, this should probably read total instead of all. So if we save and refresh, we can see that nothing changes even though we moved the table footer to sit at the end of our code. That's going to bring this lesson to a close, but first, here's a quick review of the structure of a table. At the highest level, we have the table element. Inside that, we have either the T-head, T-body, or T-foot element. Inside that, we then have a row. And then within that row, we have a table cell, which is either a piece of data, TD, or a header, TH. I'll see you in the next lesson.